As we've been reminded throughout the weekend, we're celebrating this year the anniversary of the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalised homosexual acts between men. In the UK, we've begun to see that moment, I think, as the beginning of 50 years of steady progress in LGBT rights and equalities. But as that narrative of progress and liberation begins to form up, to harden, if you like, into the accepted historical story about gay life in the 20th century, it is important not to let our history become homogenised, as if there was only one story, and as if the experience of that last half century has been the same for all of us, because it hasn't. In choosing to talk this year particularly, just about lesbian history, I don't mean to ignore or in any way to diminish the huge importance of the Sexual Offences Act for our gay brothers. But since law and citizenship are this History Month's themes, I do want to ask here today what, if anything, that socio-legal shift in socio-legal attitudes did for lesbians. When I've been speaking about my work at LGBT events, I've been told more than once by a member of the audience that lesbians never had such a hard time as gay men because they were never illegal. So this anniversary seemed to me a good time to take a quick look at lesbian life 50 years ago and see how true that was. So, what were lesbians doing in 1967? Well, the first and most obvious answer to that question is that the majority of them were hiding. This is one of my oldest interviewees, Leo, who described to me how she met and fell in love with a woman that she then lived with for the next 45 years. And they met when they worked at the same girls' school back in the early 60s. And after they'd fallen into each other's arms, she then said, but of course it went on being absolutely the same because we were still colleagues and we never met privately, hardly ever, for years. And she said, then we started going on holiday together. In 1967, these two women had been lovers for 3 years, and they still didn't feel they had the right to be seen by anybody as a couple. Now, here's another slightly younger interviewee who was born after the war, after the Second War, Silva. And she told me, as so many women have done, about their first teenage affair, which of course was brutally broken up by the other girl's mother. But I'm struck that she said, we never spoke about it, we never held hands or anything, it was only just in bed. And I kept it very secret, I didn't even tell my best friend that I was seeing her, nobody. Absolutely secret. And after it ended, she says, I lived in absolute terror. Now, this fear of discovery was so strong that for many lesbians, it wasn't only impossible to come out to their straight friends, but it was also almost impossible to come out to other lesbians. And if there's anybody else in the room as old as me who was a lesbian back then, you might recognise this experience. I think of it as the war on pronouns. She said, I remember the first night Ruth and I were talking, and we were talking about this person I am in love with until 3 a.m. And then she says, I was the first one who said she by accident. And that's what it was like. So, given this extreme level of self-censorship, it was hard even to meet other lesbians. And Judy said to me that it was very difficult to meet people because unless you're very, very brave, if you really do like someone and they're your friend, you don't want to risk losing them entirely by declaring something they probably don't want to hear. And I think, sadly, I think the next bit's sad, because Judy says, there were a couple of people that I really thought I could love, but I'd never say anything, not in a million years. And of course, in 1967, there was no internet, no gay press, no pink sofa, no gaydar girls, no diva, no Elfest, no nothing really. The lesbian magazine Arena 3, which was mentioned yesterday, had been founded in 1963, but its circulation was still absolutely tiny. And Kenrick was founded in 1965, but at that point membership of Kenrick was confined to a few women in London. So unless you'd heard of either of those things, or unless you lived near a thriving gay pub, you were pretty much isolated. The most extreme form of hiding, I suppose, if you were sufficiently butch, of course, was to pass as a man, and one of my interviewees did that. This is Sandy. After she left the Merchant Navy, she describes how she trained as an HGV driver. And while she said the drivers at the depot obviously knew I was a woman, when I was out on the road, most people assumed I was a guy, a young chap. Just get a leg pulled about being too young to drive trucks and things. And even the neighbours thought I was a guy, she said. And added, it was easy, you know. Easy. It was easy. It was easier than actually being gay. It was just easier slotting into society. Which I think gives you pause, doesn't it? The other thing that kept lesbians invisible, of course, was that they were never publicly discussed or acknowledged. The lesbian historian Alison Oram has written about how at this time the existence of lesbianism was common knowledge. People knew it existed, but they never discussed it out loud. And the main reason for that, as we heard from Diana yesterday, was because it was clear to them that if girls found out that such practices existed, then they would do it. And if they were kept in ignorance, they wouldn't. So the whole thing was completely swept under the carpet. So there were moments of lesbian public visibility, obviously, and 1967 was one of them. As it became clear that the law criminalising gay male sex was about to change, the media took an interest in homosexuality, as they called it, and occasionally that interest included women. There was a current affairs television series in the 1960s, which some of you might remember, called Man Alive, and they screened 2 programmes in the summer of that year, just before the law changed. The first programme was called Consenting Adults, the Men, and the second was called Consenting Adults, the Women. And I've given the link here because it's really worth a watch. It's on the BBC Archive website. And actually, I've also given you the link to a programme that followed later that night, which was part of the late night lineup, it was called, because that was a discussion of the programme about the women by a panel of experts. Who were? Straight. One of whom was a really evil psychiatrist. I mean, really evil. The only person who was sort of up against them was a very young and just about recognisable Maureen Duffy. So it's a lovely, lovely... well, it's not lovely, it's hideous, actually. It took me back to a place I didn't want to be. But do have a look at those if you can. The subtitle for the Man Alive film was, Can a Lesbian Ever Find True Happiness? Which tells us a lot, I think, about attitudes at the time. Unusually, in this programme, a handful of lesbians did talk publicly about their lives and loves, all but one of them straight to camera. And I think it's difficult to remember now what an enormously courageous act that was. However, the vast majority of lesbians, in spite of the stories we hear about the activists, which is lovely, the vast majority remained firmly in the closet and with very good reason. The social stigma attached to homosexuality made them, like gay men, vulnerable to discrimination both at home and at work, and the price of coming out could be high. My interviewee, Julia, who never spoke about her sexuality at work, told me a story about how she once took her partner to a work colleague's birthday party. And we danced together and we held hands, she said. And the next morning she was called into her boss's office and she was hauled over the coals and she was told that it was extremely bad behaviour, it was unprofessional, it was quite unacceptable. And as she says, it wasn't a function in the workplace itself, it was at a colleague's home, it was a private party. But as a result of that action, she eventually had to leave that job. So, for most lesbians in 1967, the closet was the only safe place to be. But looking back, we can see clearly now what damage that secrecy did, with its burden of shame and internalised homophobia. And this is just one example of many that I could have chosen to talk about how bitterly lonely and unhappy it was to be in that closet at the time. Jude describing to me how she had what she called a bit of a breakdown. She was new teacher in a new job in a strange town. She knew no one, she says. There was no one at all. There was no one I could tell anything to about how I felt. And when I said to her, and did you still think, as she told me earlier in the interview, you know, that it was wrong what you felt for other women? And she said, yes, I thought it was terrible. Why God picked me to be like that? She'd taken to drink, leading to a lifelong problem. She had become increasingly depressed, and eventually, as you see here, she took herself to the doctor. And after a little bit of hassle, she was sent off for what she describes here as some seeing to in the brain, which in her case was counselling and antidepressants. But quite a few of my interviewees were subjected to misguided psychiatric treatment. This is JJ, who was still a teenager when this happened. Her mother discovered her first lesbian affair and had her committed to a mental hospital. And as JJ says, I had shock treatment. I had 2 or 3 of them until I collapsed and they discovered I had a faulty heart valve, so they couldn't give me any more. And she goes on to say, and I came out of there still totally lost. So for a lot of lesbians, this was all just too much. And like many gay men at the time, as well as lesbians, quite a few of them got married. Sometimes it was a result of the pressure. And sometimes, as Brenda said to me, I didn't give it a thought. I just thought, this is what you do. Sometimes, however, it was a bit more calculated. I must show you this one because I just love Philippa. Philippa married a man who she barely knew because his career demanded it and she wanted to get her mother off her back, right? She says, we'd never been out together, never kissed each other before we got married. We got married in Caxton Hall. I found a note from him in the hotel when I arrived saying, gone to the Spread Eagle, join me if you feel like it. Somebody in one of my audiences last week told me the Spread Eagle was a leather bar, so he might have had a different reason for having to marry Philippa. So I left him a note saying, gone to a party, see you later, and I went down the gateways. And we got married the next day. And you won't be surprised to know that this particular one didn't last. This is how she described it. She said, I just said, I'm leaving you, darling. And he said, oh, are you coming back? And I said, don't think so. So I came back to London, she said. And it must have been 66 or 67, which is why I chose this quote, of course. The height of everything fun. So I hit the gay scene and progressed from there, basically. And she did, but I haven't got time to tell you all about that. So let's just have a quick look at the gay scene in 1967, because it was a lifesaver for so many of us. Here's Sandy, the HGV driver I mentioned earlier, who, after a really miserable start to her lesbian career as a very unhappy teenager, found an advert for a gay pub in Nottingham. Quite a long journey from where she lived, but she went down there. And it was just amazing, she said. I mean, they're all those women just like me. And I could see her face now as she was telling me. It lit up sort of 50 years later. And she said, well, it was a very drag-oriented society, and you were either butch or femme. If you were anything else, you were looked down on, she said. But, of course, for Sandy, that was absolutely heaven, because she said, I was full butch, which is her expression for it. I mean, 3-piece suit. So, and she said, it was wonderful. However, not all of my interviewees remember that butch femme scene with quite such affection. And this is, by contrast, is Lynn, who arrived in London fresh from school, and she and her lesbian girlfriend lived in a house with some much older lesbians who were then in their 50s and 60s. And Lynn said they were like from a different planet. They were very rigidly butch or femme, she says. And she didn't like it. She found it very, very repellent. She said it was like a caricature of working class life, actually, but played out in these, I'm a man and she's my woman, sort of terms. She said it was horrible, actually. I hated it. And then she quickly corrected herself and said, I didn't hate them, but I hated that way of living and that definition of sexuality. And she speaks for quite a lot of women of her generation, actually, when she says that. And she goes on to say, at that stage, we hadn't grown a lesbian feminist movement. So I don't know how I knew that this wasn't where I was going at all. But I did think at the time, if that's what being a lesbian means, then I'm not a lesbian. And that was echoed by lots and lots of the women that I've interviewed. In fact, this last comment hints at the great change that was about to hit lesbian life, the coming of the women's liberation movement. But for most women in the late 1960s, feminism hadn't happened yet. And that's another thing that is difficult for us to remember looking back now. It was important to remember it because it brings us to one of the major differences between lesbian and gay male history in the 20th century. No, we weren't illegal. But my God, dears, we were second-class citizens. Now look, here are 3 events that have shaped our present lives and we all take for granted, okay? Equal Pay Act. If men and women do the same job, they have to get the same pay. Wasn't true in 1967. When is that Act? Do you know? 1970. Good girl. And then, of course, it probably even more important, equal pay for work of equal value. Might be a different job, but it might be equally important. When was that? Do you know? 1985. And I put this one in because it's one that I remember in my own life. At what point did women become able to apply for a loan or credit in their own names? Okay. So women's financial autonomy, which I think a lot of us take for granted, is a comparatively recent phenomenon. So let's look at some other rights we take for granted now. Sex Discrimination Act. 75, yes indeed. But it's a long way ahead still in 1967. I applied for...
If you're a school child, you might need to wear trousers.
Absolutely.
The teacher said, no, it didn't apply to us, we were under 16. I asked him, he refused. They could wear trousers now in the school, I went back.
I know, isn't it lovely? I applied for a job in 63. They wouldn't even send me an application form because they said, oh no, the headmaster wouldn't appoint a woman to that job. And there was no recourse, there was no redress. So the Equal Opportunities Commission obviously came into effect the next year to put that Act into place, but didn't really do it very quickly or very effectively for quite a long time. Does anybody know, not to make a guess at what date, the Court of Appeal decided that bars and pubs were no longer able to refuse to serve women?
2010?
No, but it was into the 1980s. Okay. Now, they still ignore you, yes, unless you make yourself very large. Now, look, I make no excuse for this little excursion into feminist history, because one of the very clear messages of my research has been that for women of the generations born before 1950, feminism and lesbianism are intimately intertwined in their life stories. And because for two young women living together in the 1960s, those disadvantages were doubled. Compared with a young married couple of the time, two lesbians setting up home together in 1967, as did I and my then partner, did so not only without the knowledge and approval of their families, but with considerable financial and social disadvantages. Women's pay was lower than men's, as we had seen, so the lesbian household's income was lower than that of their heterosexual peers or their gay brothers. They couldn't afford, therefore, high rents, and however good their jobs, they weren't eligible to apply for a mortgage. Their home had to be furnished without the traditional boost of wedding presents, obviously, but they were unable to buy their furniture on the hire purchase unless they could get a father or a brother to sign the contract for them. They lacked the then significant tax breaks of a married couple and had no financial security if one partner died. They had no redress against discrimination at work, either on grounds of sexual orientation or of gender, a situation which was particularly fearful for a household with no male breadwinner. And if you worked in a white-collar job, you would not be able to wear trousers, as Nick has told us. Unisex clothing, as it was first of all called, was also some years into the future. So a lot of lesbians earned below their potential because they couldn't or wouldn't wear a skirt. And we saw Lynn's thing about working on garage forecourts earlier, didn't we? And of course, a lesbian was considered an unfit mother. So a woman who had children could, and often did, lose custody of them if she came out. And as we saw from a previous slide, even if our young lesbian couple wanted to try and drown their sorrows and forget all these troubles by going out for a drink, the barman was still within his rights to refuse to serve them. Unless, of course, like this gal, they were heading into a lesbian venue, and some of you may recognise that door in Chelsea. I'm sorry for the quality of the images in this presentation. I challenged myself only to use pictures taken in 1967, so consequently they're a bit blurry and brownie box camera sort of thing. But so to sum up, because it's time to stop. Yes, it's true that lesbians were never illegal, but they shared the same crippling social stigma as the men, and alongside that homophobic culture, they were disadvantaged and oppressed as women, in ways which it is sometimes easy to forget today. So it was a double whammy. And as we have seen, the moment of real change for us was still in the future. It would be the women's liberation movement, rather than the Sexual Offences Act, which would prove to be the watershed moment that put us on the road to freedom, both as women and as lesbians. Thank you for listening. And the next item on the programme started 2 minutes ago officially, so I think probably we didn't ought to do questions, should we, Kathy? Can I use 1 minute of it to say that some of this stuff is in the book I published last year. It's an academic book, so it's very expensive, but the publishers have offered a 20% discount on it for History Month, and the discount flyers are on the bookstall in the hall. That's what I needed, so that's my little advert over. If anybody's interested in the history of that particular lesbian venue, there is a very good book, very detailed research into the history of the Gateways Club, called From the Closet to the Screen, The History of the Gateways Club from 1945 to 1970-something, by Jill Gardner. And it's still in print, I think.
Yeah, I just read it, yeah.
Mm. You've just read it, haven't you? Yes,
I've
that's
got a
right.
friend that owns it. Just read it.
There were also some very small lesbian drinking clubs in Soho around, which lasted up until about 76, 75, 76.
I think the 70s were kind of the time when it faded away. And I think it was partly, in a strange way, that was also partly because of the women's movement, wasn't it? Because, another friend of mine was part of the feminist raid on the gateways, for instance, where they went in saying, up with this, we cannot put, butch feminist, heterosexual role-playing, away with it all. And I think, oddly, becoming a feminism also sort of changed the lesbian scene, didn't it? So,
I remember being thrown out of one of the small clubs with Jill Posner because we were trying to put up posters for her play, Any Woman Can.
Yeah.
And we were told to go away because we were a disgrace and not the sort of girls they wanted there.
yes. Well, we could talk a lot about intersectionality, but there were middle-class places and there were working-class places and you didn't always feel comfortable, even though everybody was a lesbian. No?
Brixton, Camberwell.
Oh, God, yes, they were all over London. And in some ways, I think there's a lot of work done on that. In some ways, I'm more interested in the non-metropolitan. And what actually happened in the country and in very small towns. Unfortunately, there are a lot of women all over Britain quietly doing their own oral history about their own local story, and that's brilliant because. But the pub that Sandy went to in Nottingham, of course, still going strong. The Foresters is still a lesbian pub, as far as I know, and has been for a very long time. So sometimes those things are embedded. It's quite good.
I remember the Gay Liberation Front calling Che straight gays. There was a thing between the sort of the new modern gays and then the straight gays.
Yeah.
So there was already a clash there. And then there was this other thing about being in an umbrella organisation like GLF, Gay Liberation Front, and there were men on one end and women on the other end, and they were brought together politically, yet there was such difference.
I believe we're going to hear something about that almost immediately. Is that right? What a very good lead into the next session. Thank you all very much.
Seamless.
Absolutely seamless. How good was that? And I didn't pay her or anything.
And I haven't started a small town pub.